Welcome to the latest CSA, fall CSA workshop. Today we're talking about locations. So how to find, choose, secure a distribution location for your CSA drop-off. Yeah, and so we'll dive in. I will say, every week I like prep for these workshops, and I think, like, at the beginning, I think, what on earth could I even say about this? And by the time this workshop comes around, I have a full hour of things to say about all of these topics. So you should just thank your lucky stars. You don't have to have dinner with me every night. So anyway, so our agenda today, I'll introduce GrownBy a little bit and this project, and then we'll talk through considering towns and routes and neighborhoods. We'll talk about kinds of spaces and site needs and roles and tasks. There'll be time for discussion or questions, hopefully at the end. You're also welcome to come on to video and ask a question with your voice, or you're welcome to pop a question into the chat at any point to sort of break up me talking. You're also welcome to have side conversations in the chat if you want. There is live closed captioning available with the little CC button at the bottom, and we are recording this, and we've been posting these on our YouTube channel. For anybody who couldn't make it today, or if you watch this and you think, oh man, my friend would love this conversation about locations. So as a background about Farm Generations Cooperative is a multi-stakeholder co-op, agricultural co-op. Multi-stakeholder in this case means that it's farmer owned, but also now farmer and employee owned. So we're the multi-stakeholders. And our product at Farm Generations is called GrownBy. And GrownBy, I think, is one of the very best, most comprehensive CSA platforms out there. And it's, farmer owned. We're excited about all of that stuff. And this program, so one of the things about being a co-op and being farmer owned and the way we have incorporated is in part in response to the way that other platforms have been funded. And so we try not to seek any venture capital money, and we're quite careful about that because those are investors who sometimes come calling. And a lot of the early stages of GrownBy and still development of GrownBy as a platform has been through USDA grants. And this project is a USDA Farmers Market Promotion Program, or was. Now it's over. But this project was this really exciting opportunity to look in depth at a really innovative CSA model in New York City that has been like the New York City CSA scene for almost 30 years, and to see what was happening with it, how it was working, how it was changing and evolving. And so the number 3 output of this project was a survey report, looking at those needs. The number 2 output of this was a handbook for farmers that's about CSA in New York City, but also about CSA everywhere. A lot of it's kind of applicable to everyone. And this workshop is growing out of that. This workshop series is growing out of that guide. And then there are, in addition to these workshops that we've been doing this Bootcamp series, there are 2 recorded webinars, one in English and one in Spanish, with farmers about New York City CSA programs. And one of the other outputs of this project, out of this grant funded project, was new features that were CSA specific on GrownBy. So to talk about locations, to take a deep breath and say, I've been talking for 4 weeks about the nitty-gritty details of how to have these pieces of your CSA program work well. And sometimes after I've presented, I just want to step back and put my hand on someone's shoulder and be like, no, but also the best thing to do is the most basic, easiest thing that costs you the least money. And so I'm starting there, which is to say, you're thinking about CSA distributions, one of the best options is just on farm. So if you can scale up your on-farm distribution to serve more people right there on farm, that's excellent, and you should do that first and foremost. So on-farm pickups can be really flexible, right? Like if you want to do a farmer's choice distribution, or you want to do custom shares, or you want to do U-pick, like those are all things you can do on farm in a way you cannot do off farm, right? And you can offer things that are super cool, like, I don't know, you have a shareholder who wants Mexican oregano every week, or spilantes, the like mouth numbing herb, all the time. Like you could have that in a U-pick garden, but not be including that in your share. Anyway, on-farm pickups can be far more flexible. They are also just way cheaper and more time efficient for the farm. You're not worried about storage or space rental or transportation or parking tickets or truck rental or whatever. What happens when your truck axle breaks and during distribution? All of that kind of craziness that happens with offsite distributions, you don't have to think about if you just do on farm. And then you also just have more of this community connection. You're there as a farmer. You can see your customers can see how things are grown. They can ask questions. They can pet your barn cats. I don't know, whatever. It's just a much more connected model. But that said, there are lots of farms who have grown their on-farm CSAs as large as they kind of can for where they're located, and they want to explore greater opportunity to have more members by having distributions that are at satellite locations. And that's really what we're talking about today, are those satellite locations, distributions that are off-site in some other place. And this is growing out of this New York City model that we are really familiar with. So in that case, right, we're talking about like quite far sometimes from the farm host location. This does provide a much greater opportunity for sales depending on the places that you choose for your offsite distributions. You can we'll talk today about building partnerships and coordination to have like smooth offsite drop-offs. There can be additional costs to consider, like transportation, storage, and then space rental fees. You can also one of the upsides is that you can serve a different community, right? The folks that are right around your farm might be more homogeneous than if you were serving a different neighborhood, a different town, a different city, and you can kind of reach more people that way. So neighborhood considerations, right? You're gonna know a little bit about what your options are just based on where you are, but we'll be considering a little bit like urban centers, suburban centers, and even rural areas, right? You could have CSA distribution locations in rural areas that are not on farm too. You're going to want to look for a neighborhood that has some level of population density to support our moderately sized CSA. You're really thinking like long term, how big could you grow this one location, right? Because that's going to be the most bang for your buck, the best optimization of your time and resources to drop off in one location and have 100 people pick up there. That'd be great, right? So you're going to want to think about like, is this distribution location situated in a geographical region that could support X number of members? And so that's a thing to consider. For some farms, depending on the mission of the farm, you are also going to want to consider the economic diversity of that neighborhood. So if one of your goals is to have an economically diverse CSA membership, then situating your CSA distribution in a place that's on the edge of neighborhoods that's going to be able to have folks from different incomes is going to be helpful. And then competition. This might be a place to start, right? But what areas, what towns, what neighborhoods don't have CSA distribution locations or don't have farmers markets, perhaps? And are there places that you could really fill a need that hasn't been met in that community and not be like competing for some of the same members as another farm. And one of the easier ways to do this is just to consider your relationships. Where do you already know people? Where are you already known? Um, like for when I farmed, one of the ways we did this was to be like, okay, we have a farmers market in this town. We could have it. We could use some of those farmers market customers to potentially start a CSA in this given area. Oh, this slide's a little wonky. Delivery routes. So if you're going to have, so you're going to want to think about traffic and road rules and parking, no matter where you're doing your distribution. But if you're having more than one location, so you're maybe going to plan to have a couple of CSA distribution locations, satellite off the farm, you're going to want to really map those out and consider like the ease of driving between them. So that you can have them, again, all in one, as much as you can, all in one delivery day. Some farms have, 2 distribution days, maybe a Thursday and a Tuesday, and they do 2 different routes, but, you're wanting to kind of maximize the number of members you sell to in a given the amount of like labor you're putting into that delivery. So if you have places that are close enough that they can have shared delivery routes, but far enough away that they're not competing with one another. And then one of this is about CSA size, right? When you're making that very first leap to have an offsite CSA distribution, you're often maybe, hopefully, a little oversized for the number of members that you have there, right? So maybe your truck could hold 150 shares, but you've actually only sold 60 or something like that. And you just have room to grow. So as you add delivery routes, you kind of want to think like, this is what it is now. What is it going to look like next year? How are we going to scale this up and try to get more members at any given distribution location? Do you have questions about that before we move on? Thinking a little bit about competition. So in some urban centers, like New York City, we see CSA distribution locations that are really close to each other, right? Like maybe just a couple blocks away. That's less true in a smaller town, right? I don't think that the small or suburban city that I live in could support necessarily more than one CSA distribution. But if you have a special angle or special niche and the other CSA distribution is already full, there could still be an opportunity to offer a successful CSA program. So just consider that. So in terms of kind of considering this competition question, like, are you directly competing with another farmer? You can talk to the other farmer that you can look it up. And I think Local Harvest is probably still the easiest place to find CSA distribution locations, but just, a quick Google of a town can often provide also good results. It's helpful to talk to other farmers if you're considering a distribution in a neighboring town or something like that, to just be clear and communicative with another farmer. There's a bullet point here, right, about coalitions of CSA farmers. I recognize that I live in the Hudson Valley, and I am really lucky to live in a place that has like very strong coalitions of farmers that are in communication with each other. But I think as much as you can be doing that locally and being in community with other CSA farmers, I think that's like emotionally great as a farmer, but it's also logistically really helpful. So we know lots of farms that have a distribution location that's been passed on to them by somebody else they know, somebody else who was retiring or scaling down. or something like that, and they're saying, "Hey, I have these 65 members at this location. I'm not going to serve them anymore, and I'm looking for another farmer to take over." So that's something that also sometimes happens, and just I think as much as you can, being in that community allows the opportunity to take over when that's up for grabs. Um, and then we're going to talk a little bit about workplace CSAs. So when you're thinking about your roots and thinking about where other CSAs are located, I think considering some large employers within a given region can be an important thing to also sort of map out. Um, so community partners. So this is also a very important direction you could go. A couple of slides earlier, I said, like, think about where you have a reputation, where you have partnerships, where you're like known as a farm. That's harder to do if you're brand new, but if you have some history, um, that's a really great starting point. If you are if you are starting a CSA in a community you don't know at all, then I think finding really good partners is one of the best first steps. So partners could be nonprofit organizations that are concerned about food access, or like cooking clubs, or partnerships of, maybe a PTA is a good example. Local sustainability groups, folks that would be like-minded and interested in CSA membership for some reason. Those can be really great first partners in the process of finding a good distribution location. On the other hand, if you are a little bit familiar with this community and you already have a friend, a contact, potential members, some organizational partner, like, you really want to rely on their local knowledge. They're most likely to know the neighborhood, to know where people gather, what's going to be most appropriate, what are going to be some needs that people in that neighborhood might have. So that's a good angle. That's a very community organizer-y angle. Um, here is just a list that I have brainstormed about distribution location possibilities. Hold on a second, I'm going to cough. Um, I brainstormed this last night with my husband, who also spent about a decade as a commercial vegetable farmer. And we talked about some of the pros and cons of all of these, but so I'll run through the list, although of course you can read them too. But community centers, right? Just lots of space, centrally located, sometimes good, decent parking. Houses of worship, so churches, mosques, synagogues. That is a very common CSA distribution location. Community gardens, which are like-minded but also outdoors. Libraries, which are often, are an important hub of a community. Again, also sometimes pretty centrally located, sometimes have community rooms, good parking. Parks, which, like community gardens, are going to have the outdoor issue. YMCAs or gyms. I think YMCAs can be a really nice uh, location because they sometimes have lots of extra space. They often have, other community activities happening in that same place. Gyms can also be good. You're certainly then already working with a clientele that's interested in health and wellness. Schools and universities. Schools, like elementary schools, were, I don't know, 20 years ago, I was a member of a CSA that was in a school, in a elementary school. I think that would be very hard to do now, because of the level of security that is required, and also just sort of the way that schools are. Just it may be hard, but that might be another location that works for you. Also, private schools have very different rules around some of that, and also anything you can dovetail in, any distribution location that can very easily match with someone's existing schedule. So if people are picking up their kids or going home from work and this distribution can be right there, it's like that makes it very easy for people to see how they could join. Universities are also really common both because they can be in some level a workplace CSA. There are lots of folks who work at a university or live at a university. Um, and they also have public space. So I used to pick up a winter CSA that was at a public university. Workplaces, we'll talk more about. Hospitals can also be like a bit of a workplace. Like it can be incentivized by the hospital themselves. Or it can just be in service to a community. And I think as we see produce prescription programs, I think sometimes those are linked directly with hospitals. Private businesses like breweries, restaurants, cafes, natural food stores, when this works well, it's awesome, right? Like the idea of swinging by your local brewery at 4 p.m. I don't know what you're doing at 4 p.m., but maybe, or 5 p.m., and like picking up a growler and your share for the week sounds great. When you work with a private business that like is really solid and in cooperation with you, this can work really well. It also can be a little bit challenging because you're depending on another private business to stay in business, to be clear and communicative, stuff like that. Um, Farmers markets, there are farms that have CSA distributions at farmers markets where they already sell. You have to be thoughtful about the rules and regulations of your own farmers market. Um, oh, we have a couple of duplicates on this slide. Whoops. So we went through hospitals, businesses, and then, the other thing about a private business that can be really helpful is we're not talking too much about donation in specifically in here, but lots of times with the CSA distribution, at the end of distribution, there's a bit of food left over. And so I think it's helpful to think in what's going to happen to that food and how is that going to be donated or used. And with private businesses like a restaurant or a cafe or a natural food store, that business may be able to incorporate that produce into their offerings, what they have. Nonprofit organizations, that's I think there are some that have, certainly we know, like I know of a CSA distribution that's at the Caymans Health Center, and anything that might have members who are affiliated or have a mission that's aligned with getting better farm fresh local produce into a community. Similarly, emergency food providers, we see CSA distribution sometimes there because that donation process works really well. It can provide, I think, really good visibility to an emergency food provider, which are sometimes right in our neighborhoods, but we don't always know about if they're not a thing that we need to use ourselves. So I think emergency food providers can be a great location also. And private homes. Private homes are not something that I tend to think of as a great distribution location. However, I think they're very easy, right? And in a suburban community, you as a farmer could say, like, if you can get 15 people together, I'll drop off these boxes in your garage. And then those 15 people pick up. And that can be a distribution location that works really well for some farms. So that's out there. And that's a pretty light lift. And also, even as the homeowner and member in that situation, like to have some people come and pick up out of your garage might be very easy. You might not even, feel like you need to oversee it too much. So I have a winter share that I pick up out of somebody's driveway, and I've never met the people. There's not a lot of community around it, but it's smooth and easy. And there's no site fee also. So there are some really good guides out there, both CSA, Community in Support of Agriculture, I think is what that stands for, and Fair Share both have guides to starting workplace CSAs. Workplace CSAs just mean a CSA that is like based in a work area where lots of people are coming and is marketed toward those employees. Sometimes these are private, so only employees could join, or sometimes they're public, like we encourage employees to join, but if you lived nearby, you could pick up there too. It's great for members and employees, right? Because it's like if you were already at work, then it's super easy to pick up your share. And maybe in a week when you're on vacation, it's no big deal to ask a coworker to cover your share, whatever. Sometimes these are really a collaboration between the farm and the workplace employer. So sometimes an employer will say, this is a thing we really want to offer. Because it fits with our wellness objectives through our HR department, or because, whatever, we can incentivize, like the University of Kentucky incentivizes CSA shares through vouchers for their employees. So sometimes an employer will come looking for a farm to do CSA distributions at a workplace like this. So putting yourself out there as like open to this possibility is helpful. This works best with larger workplaces, right? You can imagine like a 15-member staff is not gonna be such a great fit as if you had a workplace that's kind of a campus of 1,000 employees or something. You also have to take some considerations for when employees move on, they quit, they're fired, they move to a different location, or what happens when employees aren't there for whatever reason. I think workplace CSAs may have changed significantly since 2020. It's not a question I've asked many farmers, but there are some workplaces where people just aren't there every day anymore. And we talked a little bit about health and wellness rebates. Does anybody have questions about those directions before we move on to site needs? Right, so site needs, there are like I feel like it's funny. It's a funny thing to say to a farmer, right? Like you should think about how you're going to unload your truck, because I think most farmers are thinking about that immediately. It's like a first thing you think when you pull up in front of a potential distribution location is like, is this going to work or not? But truck parking and unloading is a huge piece of what is going to make your distribution day and deliveries like easy and smooth, or kind of a giant headache. So you want to think about curb cuts so that you can hand truck things. You want to think about stairs, meaning fewer of them and hopefully none at all. You're going to want to think about how that hand truck or whatever tool you're using to get your shares inside can navigate through the space of the interior of this distribution location, or exterior, right? Like if you're in a park, or if you have to go over gravel for the 100 feet, like these are things you're going to want to look at and be like, does this work? One of the things that is kind of interesting in New York City specifically is that in front of houses of worship, there's usually a parking space for the church leader, or the leader of the mosque or the synagogue. And so there's this dedicated spot that is sometimes front and center and easy to unload in. In a more suburban or rural area, this is not going to be, the parking and the curb cuts are maybe not as big of considerations as in New York City. But certainly you're still going to deal with stairs and trying to get your stuff inside, and kind of thinking about that, like if you're using a YMCA or a library or something like that, like it could be a great location, but the room that they're offering could be, down 4 corridors. So just kind of, taking all of that into account. Storage. So CSA distribution locations have different, depending on the farm, have different needs for storage, right? But in most situations, you're going to want to have at least some tables, maybe whiteboards or chalkboards. You might want to have, maybe there's some things you'd love to keep securely there, like a tablet, or checking folks in, but maybe there's almost nothing that you require. So like I talked about a winter CSA in a suburban driveway, right? My winter shares get delivered in a box, like the ones we saw on the very first slide. Whoops. And like, oh, like this kind of box. If you are delivering your shares in a box like this with a customer's name on them, perhaps, or even not, like the only storage requirement is for, say, a clipboard. Um, and also, sometimes members return those bins. So if you're allowing those to go back to the farm, there might be some storage required. You do want to think about room to grow. So, um, you know, one of your assessments of the first walkthrough of a potential site is going to be like, is this located in a neighborhood where I could get a target number of members? But also, like, what would it feel like to have 100 folks come through this location? Versus, like in that first year, if you only have 30, it might feel very different. Some of the location possibilities that we discussed in the previous slide were outdoor areas. So that can be a possibility too. Indoor, outdoor areas is like a thing to consider. So outdoor spaces are often ones that feel maybe really friendly and like a really lovely community space. It can be like, bringing people out to a community garden and people linger and chat. It can also mean that it's cold and rainy during distribution, or, you might have the added concern in the later parts of the season of like, is my produce going to freeze if it sits out in boxes for an hour or 3 hours in this outdoor space? So that's a consideration. One of the farmer considerations, we kind of touched a little bit on distribution. So how will donation at the end of distribution work in this space? Is there a member who might facilitate that and move that leftover produce somewhere else? Or maybe some other, could the site host take that produce with them to distribute through the organization or in some other way? And then just this question of how many members to make a site drop off reasonable. And that's pretty tricky. I think that's really for a farm to decide. I think the idea of a distribution site that's fewer than 20 starts to feel a little bit tricky. But if it's like in line with other, if you're doing a number of drop offs over a route, maybe 15 could seem reasonable. And certainly I know farmers who say like, I wouldn't have a distribution location that was fewer than 50, just to try to make like the communication clearer, the messaging clearer, like as much as you can get many people to pick up at one spot, the better off you are. And then there are some member considerations. So, these are things you want to think about, like what is the member experience of this location going to be like? So a site that feels inclusive, comfortable, mission aligned, like a general vibe. You thinking about members who might be differently able, then like making sure your site is ADA compliant, curb cuts, avoiding stairs. Those are going to be some of the same things that you're going to want to think about as a farmer. In urban and suburban areas, you can think about subways and trains and bike paths. I think even in, I live in a suburban area. Oh, you don't know, but I live in a suburban area where people commute by train. And I don't think that the MTA would ever allow a distribution like on MTA property, but just thinking about pairing a distribution location near a popular train station and a pickup that kind of dovetailed into the hour of the day when people are getting off train and going home, I think is a way to make the member experience, make members like very easily pick up and get their produce and take their produce home. It makes it very streamlined. And thinking about like certainly in an urban setting, you want to be near public transportation if people are not, if people aren't maybe using cars as much. There we are. I think I froze for a minute. Ease of entry in suburban and rural areas, parking. I think it's hugely important for members. So because people are going to be coming and like sometimes shares can be heavy, right? Best case scenario, your share is plentiful and bountiful and it's so much that somebody would not want to trek very far with it. So parking is is key, can be key. But thinking about bike paths, even in suburban and rural areas, can also be nice. Ease of entry into the building, the hours of the location. So in some cases, that means you're going to want to be choosing a distribution time that is exactly, when the library is open, for instance. But in other cases, you are going to want to be choosing times where the church is not in session. So considering that in thinking about the site needs. And then extra perks. So like I think an extra perk is like this dovetails nicely into my commute. But also an extra perk is like I can pick up a great loaf of sourdough at this bakery that the distribution is in, or my distribution's at a health food store. And so that makes it really easy to buy, the other stuff that I might need that's not included in my share. So, as a member, those are things you'd be excited about. And then once you've found a site that you are, like, this would be a great location, there are some details that you will need to discuss. So that question about supplies, like, do they have tables, chairs, brooms you can use? If they don't, is there storage location where you can store your tables, chairs, and brooms? Is there storage for bins or boxes for signage, tables, tents, etc.? Tents meaning outdoor. So if you have a outdoor distribution location, a tent is important. Cleaning up. So how do you need to leave the location at the end of distribution? Is there staff that's cleaning up? Are you overseeing this distribution and you're cleaning up, or are there member volunteers who can do that? Clean tables, locking up at the end of distribution, so making sure the site is left secure. And then some legal considerations. So, will either the site host or the farm need to make changes to insurance documents? So it's not uncommon for a distribution location to ask to be included on liability insurance as an additional insured or vice versa. And this is a great place for an MOU. I think I am a person who loves a contract. I think it just spells out so clearly what, maybe not even a super legally binding contract, but just some written document to spell out, like, these are the things you said you would do. These are the things I said I would do. This is what we agreed upon, that you can return to later if there are questions or concerns. And then the other thing is about fees. So, hold on, I'm going to cough again. Some sites will ask for a fee to cover the cleaning, the wear and tear, staff time, etc. That's commonly a fee that is passed on to the member. We see lots of we get this question at GrownBy all the time, like how to include site fees. It's helpful to understand from the farm if this is a fee that's by member, right? So the distribution location might say it'd be great to have $10 a year for every one of these shares or something like that, $5 a year. Or if there's just one, that word should be flat, not fat. A fat seasonal fee is different from a flat seasonal fee. But if there's just one, maybe they say, yeah, for $200, we can rent this room to you for the season every Wednesday or something. So just considering that site fee and making sure that you've discussed that, and how they want to be paid and when. And really you can pass that on to your members no matter how it's set up. So that, that's just kind of a cost of doing business. And this last slide, this last little, I don't know that this is actually the last one, but the last part of this agenda is just thinking about tasks, roles, and responsibilities at the distribution location. So these are things to kind of think through how it will work to have an offsite distribution. Some of these can be fulfilled by the staff if it is a building that is overseen, like the library or a synagogue. And some of these tasks will have to happen by the farm or maybe by staff of the farm. One thing to point out is that in New York City, so this project, as I said at the beginning, is based on this model in New York City. And in New York City, what they have are core groups. So there are these core groups that manage a CSA distribution location. They, in many cases, work quite autonomously from the farm. They get their own members, they do their own recruitment, they manage the site, and the farmer just has to like drop off the shares in this location and move on. Um, this is a model that, when it works well, works super well. And I also think it can be replicated well in other locations outside of New York City. So I had a CSA distribution many, many years ago. It was in a food pantry in a small town, and we had a volunteer who, after the first year, really showed himself to be like enthusiastic and excited to be there and excited to talk about like, how did you use last week's eggplant? You also probably have this member if you have a CSA. And so we said, hey, John, we will give you a free share if every week you come and you oversee distribution. And we discussed with the pastor who led the food pantry, and they met each other. And we, in this roles and responsibilities, when we dropped off the produce, we unlocked the site and set everything up. But then this member oversaw the distribution and was there to check people in and be a friendly face, um, and to kind of make everything run really smoothly, and to clean up at the end of the night and ensure that everything was left looking spiffy. So these are some roles and responsibilities you kind of want to think through. There's also the task at location of member communication. So on some sites, there's no member communication that happens at a distribution location. Like, nobody is checking in to see that a member is coming to pick up their share. A member might check their name off of a list. But in some places, there's somebody there, like this guy, John, to check in members. That person might be a volunteer, might be somebody from the farm, it might be somebody on staff. They might send a text or a quick phone call to anyone who's running late to just ensure that they are coming, or maybe that they're not and their share should get donated. That is the kind of thing people want to do like 5 minutes before distribution closes down, because they're getting antsy to tidy. And then there's also a question about communication about overdue payments. So if you have a customer, if you have a sort of installment payment plan, that might mean that there are people who haven't paid at the distribution location. Thinking about, like, is that a conversation you want to be having there? Is that a conversation the farm should be having, or volunteers, however that should work? Is any payment collected at distribution? That's just a thing to consider for your farm and your setup. Again, if the distribution is overseen by the farmer, that might be really appropriate. In many cases, it might be just a big old headache. And, I work for GrownBy. We would encourage you to be doing all of your sales online through GrownBy to make your life easier and to make those payments really trackable. And then thinking about setup and cleanup at the end. What happens to extra produce? How the donation works? Does somebody come and pick it up, or does a volunteer take it somewhere? Sweeping, cleanup, etc., locking up. And so that is what I had to say about distribution locations. It's kind of a lot, but also, I don't know, maybe all hopefully helpful. Does anyone have questions? They want to come off of mute or put your questions in the chat to talk through a distribution conundrum you're having, or anything you're concerned about. Okay, as always, these videos will be shared. I say that these slides will be shared, but probably I just posted as a video. Um, We also have a handbook or a workbook for farmers about CSA, so you should check that out. I can put that link in the chat. There are still workshops coming up, so there are 4 more. I'm gonna put here in the chat, I'm gonna put a couple of things, including, whoops. So I'm putting here in the chat a link to the website where our workbook is, a Medium article about these sessions, and a link to sign up for, you'll be able to sign up for any of the upcoming ones, one about marketing, communication strategies, so what you kind of things to put in a newsletter, event management and planning for CSA events, and evaluation techniques and surveys. Oh, did it work? There we go. And then there's also a link to sign up on my schedule if you have time that you want to chat with me, or if you're ready to set up your CSA on GrownBy. I can help with that. And I'd be curious to know, these are the topics that we have listed, but if there are other topics that you feel like you have been trying to figure out as CSA farmers that you want to talk through, it'd be interesting to know those too. And if there are no more questions, or no questions at all, then I can end our recording here.